you think survival was the whole story. You picture your ancestors hunched in a cave, shivering, waiting for the next disaster to thin the herd. Cold, hungry, one bad winter from extinction. That image is comfortable. It lets you believe progress is a straight line, and you're standing at the top of it. But 2 million years before writing, before agriculture, before anything you'd call civilization, your ancestors were already running a controlled experiment on fire, food, and cooperation, and the data survived in rock, ash, and your own digestive tract. The cavemen never existed. What existed was an engineer with no lab and no margin for error. So what actually happened out there? Here's the misconception. Early humans were opportunists, grabbing whatever they could before something bigger grabbed them. Wrong. At Gona, in Ethiopia, stone tools dated to 2.6 million years ago showed deliberate, repeated striking angles, the same flake removed the same way, over and over, by hands that had already learned the geometry of fracture. That's not luck. That's a manufacturing standard. Here's the first thing that changes everything. Cooking wasn't a comfort. It was a systems upgrade. Raw meat and raw plants cost enormous energy to digest. Your gut has to work as hard as your brain does now. At Wonderwork Cave in South Africa, burned bone and ashed plant matter, buried nearly 1 million years deep, mark one of the earliest known controlled fires. Controlled means tended, fed, protected from rain and wind. That single behavior rewired the body's entire energy budget. Cooked food breaks down faster. Faster digestion means more calories absorbed per bite, which means less gut tissue is needed to process it. Gut tissue is expensive, metabolically. It competes directly with the brain for fuel. Shrink the gut, and you free up energy for something else entirely. That's the same trade your laptop makes when it throttles one process to power another. The brain that resulted needed protein, and protein at scale required better weapons, not sharper luck. At school, Ningen, Germany, wooden spears, roughly 300,000 years old, were carved with a balance point set deliberately near the front third, the same design logic a modern javelin uses for flight stability. These weren't sticks. They were calculated instruments, built by people who understood aerodynamics without a word for the concept. A spear like that could bring down a horse from a distance. That single design decision changed everything that followed. Hunting became coordinated, not desperate, and coordination meant something your ancestors needed just as badly as fire: each other. By the time fire, cooking, and weapon making were routine, your ancestors weren't a handful of scattered survivors. They were networks, trading tool techniques, sharing kill sites, teaching children napping, angles passed down for tens of thousands of years without significant deviation. A technique held that stable, that long, only survives through teaching. Teaching requires trust. Trust requires a group larger than a single family. Here's the part that doesn't add up. If your ancestors were this capable, fire-wielding, tool engineering, cooperating in networks, the population should have grown. Steadily, predictably, the way any successful species expands. But genetic evidence tells a different story. Studies of ancient DNA point to a severe population bottleneck roughly 900,000 years ago. A period in which the entire ancestral human population may have dropped to a breeding group, numbering only in the low thousands. Not a tribe, barely a town, for tens of thousands of years. The species that would become you was standing at the edge of a cliff it didn't know it was standing on. Sit with that for a moment. Every tool, every fire, every taught technique, and it almost wasn't enough. The resolution isn't heroism, it's geography. Ice core data from Antarctica and ocean sediment isotope records from that period show violent, repeated swings in global climate, long droughts followed by punishing cold, over and over, with no stable season to plan around. Most of the ancestral range became unlivable. What saved the line wasn't a single, brilliant survivor. It was a handful of climate refugia, pockets of stable rainfall and forage, likely in parts of southern and eastern Africa, where small groups held on, generation after generation, because the environment gave them just enough to work with. That sounds like the end of the story. A near extinction, a refuge, a recovery. Solved. Here's what nobody told you. The very bottleneck that nearly erased your ancestors may be the reason cooperation became non-negotiable rather than optional. When a population shrinks that far, every surviving group becomes irreplaceable. There's no reserve population to replace them if they fail. Genetic and archaeological evidence both suggest that after this bottleneck, tool traditions became more standardized, not less, and spread across wider distances than before. Isolation nearly killed the line. What pulled it back from the edge was groups that had learned, out of necessity, to depend completely on each other. Zoom out, and the pattern holds for everything that follows. Agriculture, cities, medicine, every institution built afterward. None of it came from individual genius operating alone. It came from small groups refusing to let each other die, generation after generation, until refusal became a permanent behavior. Your ancestors didn't outrun the crisis. They out-cooperated it. You are not watching a story about primitive people who got lucky. You are the output of a filter that almost failed. Every fire tended through a freezing night mattered. Every spear, balanced by hand, mattered. Every technique, taught to a child who wasn't your own, mattered. None of it was guaranteed. All of it worked. That was the baseline.